My name's Jason Jarrett. I'm an exercise scientist and an exercise physiologist. Every injury is unique and every fitness goal is unique. Work with me and you'll get the professional direction you need with your situation. Welcome back to another episode. So today I'll be talking quite a bit about something called chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is something that's a little bit personal for me, I guess, because I have chronic fatigue syndrome, so I'm fairly familiar with the symptoms and what this disease or what this syndrome actually feels like. There's a little bit of stigma with chronic fatigue syndrome because people used to think it was like the sort of thing that affected rich people, or that it was all psychological or in someone's head, or that people were just lazy. So chronic fatigue syndrome can be quite difficult too, because it's one of those illnesses that is invisible, and actually, for all intents and purposes, you can look relatively fit on the outside, but not be particularly energetic or obviously be susceptible to bouts of fatigue. So it's a hidden illness, really. So it's something you might have no idea that someone suffers from it, and it can be quite debilitating. Chronic fatigue syndrome, so it's a syndrome, so that means the diagnosis is more reliant on the symptoms and how a person presents. We don't really know what causes it. That's why it's a syndrome. It tends to have some tight correlations with things like if a person had mononucleosis or glandular fever when they were younger, we know that there's not a really tight correlation, but there is a correlation between glandular fever and developing chronic fatigue later in life, as well as some other viral illnesses in your teen years can be correlated with chronic fatigue development later on. Chronic fatigue is essentially, it's kind of like when you exert yourself too much, and that can mean different things to different people with chronic fatigue as well. So when you exert yourself too much, you suffer for often days, possibly longer at a time, from fatigue, just overwhelming fatigue. And I guess probably the easiest way of explaining it is it's probably similar to what you experience when you're sick, that level of just whole body fatigue, like your body just needs to do nothing to recover. And chronic fatigue is debilitating. Two things tend to be the primary exacerbators of symptoms: physical activity, but physical activity like standing and walking, which is surprising, right? So a lot of standing and walking is often correlated with exacerbating fatigue in someone with CFS. And stress and anxiety. So if you're putting yourself through a lot of stress, that can exacerbate symptoms as well. Me personally, I tend to be the latter. So if I go through a stressful period, my whole body can not shut down, but I will be overcome with fatigue for days at a time, where I'm almost incapable of focusing. Another thing, one of the very common symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome: fuzziness in the brain, not on the face, not this fuzziness, but just difficulty focusing. So when you have chronic fatigue, or you're having a bout of it as someone who has chronic fatigue syndrome, it can be really difficult to focus. Again, just like when you're sick, you can't really, you feel a bit vague. So it can be really difficult at times because you need to work, you need to be focused, you need to be switched on and doing your thing, and that can be difficult. Anyway, it's extra difficult compared to some other injuries and illnesses because it's not seen, and even sometimes when you go to doctors like GPs. Sorry, I'm reliving the moment because I went to a GP this week. I decided to escalate my chronic fatigue treatment. Being an exercise physiologist, to date, I've managed for years quite well. I'm well managed with exercise and nutrition and just being proactive with lifestyle type things. But I thought, okay, I really want to perhaps take it a step further, maybe do a sleep study or something along these lines. Now, it just caused me pain to think about it. So I saw a new doctor, and the first thing she told me was maybe I should drink more coffee. Lord. So if you don't know much about chronic fatigue, it is exacerbated by caffeine intake, if anything. Not a good idea to recommend someone with chronic fatigue just drink more coffee. Not a good idea. Also, alcohol intake can exacerbate chronic fatigue. It puts you on a spiral. Caffeine's a stimulant, a physiological stimulant. Alcohol's a physiological depressant. That's not a good roundabout to be on when you have chronic fatigue syndrome. Really not, because it will exacerbate your whole body flare-ups. So that's strike number one for this doctor. Don't tell someone with chronic fatigue or suspected chronic fatigue to maybe drink more coffee. That's just face-palm worthy. The second thing is, I'm too young to have chronic fatigue syndrome. This is an old myth, and it shouldn't be coming out of the words of a health or medical professional. You can't be too young for chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not for people just over 40 or 50. Anyone at any age can have chronic fatigue syndrome, and you might not know it. Just from, I can be fine one day, I can be fine and happy, but if I do something that exacerbates it the next day or two, I can be out of it. It can be quite temperamental. Also, people with chronic fatigue syndrome do tend to be a little bit more susceptible to getting sick, viruses and colds and illnesses. Like, if it's around, they'll get it. And the problem is, what happens when they get the virus or the cold or the illness? They get chronic fatigue with it. It sets off the chronic fatigue. So they have a longer recovery with the virus or the illness. And even when the virus is gone, they still have fatigue. It hangs around for a couple of days longer. It just affects your life so much, guys. I can't even express that enough, how much it affects you. Let's tie this back to actual injuries as such. Now, if you've watched my videos, you know I've also got the joy of a chronic lower back injury. Well, guess what happens when you've got a chronic lower back injury and chronic fatigue and you get sick? So even if your chronic fatigue is well managed, so say I'm not getting chronic fatigue, and say my chronic back injury is well managed, which it is, and you generally don't get pain. But do you know what can happen when you get a really bad virus? And I've had this, and it was awful, because I was at a festival with my mum, a folk music festival. It was a lot of fun, but I caught whatever the flu was that was going around these hippies. I tell you, I think I think these hippies just don't shower. I'm kidding. I'm in Melbourne. I can't say that too loud, but no, seriously. Anyway, it was a great festival, but oh man, I got the virus that was going around that festival, and I was so sick. And what happened as soon as I got sick? My back pain flared up. Didn't have to do anything. My pain flared up, and my chronic fatigue. It's great, guys. It's like you win on all three counts. Really, it's great. So the best thing you can do is just when you get flare-ups, and you'll get them, no matter how well managed you are. And I'm very well managed, of course. I'm here, I do these video series, but you know what? Once you got a chronic injury, it's just a journey, and just accept it and work with it. When you get these things happening together, you get sick and all your things flare up, you just have to manage it and not stress, and just deal with it, and just be gentle with yourself, because as I've talked about before, there's the mental health spectrum. So if you get anxious just thinking about it, that can feed into the whole thing too. So it's important just to take care of yourself. At the end of the day, take care of yourself and manage as best you can. And really, that's what this is all about. Also, when you get health professionals who are just saying ludicrous things, look, critical thinking always applies, whether you're listening to me or a doctor, whoever you're listening to, or a friend. You've got to think critically. Does this make sense? Does it gel with what I've been told in the past? Does it have the ring of truth? And if it doesn't, could I be wrong? Maybe I don't have chronic fatigue. What if there is an underlying long-term infection? Or so I'm open-minded to a doctor telling me, oh, you know what? Have you tried this or that? Maybe it's not chronic fatigue. Or maybe your fatigue is correlated to something we can pin down. Maybe it is. But for God's sake, when someone sits in front of you, as in my example, and says, oh, drink more coffee, when we know that's bad for chronic fatigue, or you're too young to have chronic fatigue. It's like, what are you even talking about? I have clients myself with chronic fatigue who are way younger. By the way, I'm almost 40. ain't too young for chronic fatigue. I don't know if she was looking at my medical file while she was right there in front of the computer, but most people with chronic fatigue are in their 40s anyway, so she strikes out on 2 counts with that one. Guys, so then, look, there's so many directions I could take this, but you've got to think critically, but you've also got to be a bit humble. Could I be wrong? Could be, but that sounds really stupid what she's saying. So I think I'm going to find someone who's a little bit less stupid, because what she's saying is outright wrong. Even if my chronic fatigue is related to something specific, we could nail it down. It's not really chronic fatigue syndrome. What she's saying is just wrong. I need to get away from that, and someone who knows what they're talking about. So you've got to be a bit humble, like, maybe I've been wrong about a few things or made assumptions, but also use your critical thinking. If someone's saying something that makes you just go, holy crud, get out of there. So I hope I don't, look, I say that because I'm sure I've said things to people in the past that have probably given them that reaction, but I know it's because their assumptions are wrong. So I do my best to, when I know they've got assumptions that if I challenge directly, they're just going to run away, I don't directly challenge them. So anyway, from your perspective, you've just got to take care of yourself when you've got these chronic injuries and illnesses. You've got to use your critical thinking always, but also be a bit humble. Maybe you've made assumptions and been wrong about a few things. I'm sure I have in the past too. I'm not a doctor. I'm an exercise physiologist. So I defer to the doctor's diagnoses, but what she said was silly, just wrong from a health perspective. So no, I'm going to another doctor. I'm not going to shop around, but I'm going to another doctor who knows something about chronic fatigue syndrome. And she's obviously making it up on the spot because she doesn't know the kindergarten level stuff when it comes to chronic fatigue. So also this brings me to, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's what I do, right? Bit of a tangent. Be careful about judging people in public or assuming that they should give way to you. Doesn't matter if you're a parent or you have a more obvious disability, or maybe you're elderly, and I'm using this as an example because my chronic fatigue is not that bad. I've got clients who are way worse. In fact, one of my clients with chronic fatigue syndrome, her symptoms are exacerbated when she stands for 20 minutes. This is not uncommon for people with higher level chronic fatigue syndrome. Just standing for 20 minutes can be quite bad for them. She has to sit on the tram. I implore you, if you see a person in their 20s or 30s sitting, don't assume that they must give way to you or to someone else who has a physically obvious disability. You don't know if the person seated has an invisible disability, that, or even an actual musculoskeletal disability which necessitates they sit, or a back injury. I mean, come on. You don't know. You can't judge. Someone could look fit and healthy, and I certainly do look fit and healthy, but people wouldn't know I have chronic fatigue syndrome. It's like, oh, you go to the gym, you work out, you're fine. It's like, no, I'm not really. I'm fine in many ways, but I have chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm lucky for the most part. The only thing that exacerbates it personally for me is a lot of walking or a lot of driving where I have to concentrate, or a lot of stress, or like a cold or a flu. Those things I know will set me off to an extent, depending. Particularly the anxiety, stress. I was sick all the way through uni with chronic fatigue before I even knew it was chronic fatigue. So guys, just be careful about making assumptions about people in public who maybe you think they're being rude because they're not doing that. Oh, why aren't they giving way? It's like, well, maybe they have a good reason for not giving way. Like a really good reason. Maybe they're more needing that thing than the other person. So careful with the assumptions and judgment, but at the same time, when it comes to your health, you just got to look after yourself, really. Isn't that what it always comes down to? But you do, and use your critical thinking, but be a bit humble. It's like a balancing act. Sometimes I know you just got to be in this spot of calm reason, non-judgmental, calm reason, looking after yourself, and just going from there. Thanks for joining me.